The ground shook beneath us. I stumbled, barely catching myself before I face planted into the dust. The air tasted metallic, thick with ozone and something else, a scent I couldn't quite place. It wasn't Earth anymore, not in the way most would think. The planet we called home was now more of a proving ground, and we were its last graduates. They said Earth was a prison, I muttered under my breath, eyes scanning the horizon. Smoke billowed from distant hills, and the sun hung lower in the sky than it should. But this feels like something else. Boot camp. That's what it had become. The place where they made us tougher, stronger, and deadlier. The planet had trained us for this moment, even if we hadn't realized it. Every trial, every disaster, every moment of struggle, it all led to this day. Today, we face the unknown. Lieutenant Daniels, a rough voice snapped me out of my thoughts. Sergeant McKinnon, grizzled and scarred, with eyes like steel, stood at the edge of our camp. His shadow stretched across the uneven ground like a towering omen. We're moving out in 5. Gear up. 5 minutes. Not nearly enough time to process what we were about to do, but it was the only time we'd get. The aliens, those we couldn't see, the ones who thought they could hide from us, had made their first move. And now it was our turn. I tightened the straps on my exosuit, feeling the cold metal press into my skin. McKinnon didn't wait for a reply. He didn't need to. I was already grabbing my rifle and heading toward the others, who were packing up camp with swift efficiency. We'd been trained for this, after all. "You think they're close?" Mason asked as I joined the group, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Mason, always the anxious one. Tall and lanky, with a nervous energy that seemed misplaced in a soldier's body. But when the fighting started, no one was quicker with a trigger than him. I gave a slight nod. "Yeah, close enough. I can feel it." Mason's hand tightened around his weapon. "How? We haven't seen them, haven't heard anything." "Smell," I said, cutting him off. "We can smell them." That was the secret. The one thing the aliens hadn't counted on. They could hide from our technology, mask their presence from our scanners, but they couldn't mask their scent. Earth had sharpened our instincts. We could smell things others couldn't. And right now, the scent was getting stronger. "All units, prepare for engagement." McKinnon's voice came through the comms, the crackle of static underlying his words. "They're here." I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse quicken. This was it. The moment we'd been waiting for. We moved in formation, cutting through the barren landscape like a well-oiled machine. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, and the temperature dropped with it. Cold air bit at my exposed skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was too focused on the mission, on the scent that was growing more intense with every step. "There," Mason's voice broke the silence, pointing toward a ridge up ahead. At first, I didn't see anything. Just rocks and dirt, the same as everywhere else. But then I caught a glimpse, a shimmer in the air, like heat rising off pavement. The invisible ones. They thought they were clever, using some kind of cloaking technology to hide from us. But they didn't know we had evolved, adapted. We could smell them, even when we couldn't see them. McKinnon didn't hesitate. "Fire at will." We opened fire, the crack of rifles breaking the stillness. Bullets ripped through the air, and for a moment, I wondered if we'd hit anything. But then, the shimmer flickered, and one of them appeared, tall, thin, with skin that seemed to shift and ripple like liquid metal. "Got one," Mason shouted, his face lighting up with a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. But there were more, dozens, maybe hundreds. The air around us seemed to distort as they moved, their forms becoming visible only in brief flashes. The battle was chaos, pure and simple, but we were prepared. Earth had taught us to adapt, to survive. We'd fought wars against our own, faced disasters that would have wiped out weaker species. "Keep pushing," McKinnon barked, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Don't let them close the distance." The aliens were fast, faster than anything we'd ever faced. But speed didn't matter when you had instinct. I dropped to one knee, steadying my rifle as another shimmer appeared to my left. I squeezed the trigger, feeling the familiar kick of the weapon as the bullets tore through the air. The alien dropped, its body crumpling into a heap of silver and black. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We need to flank them," I shouted over the comms, already moving before McKinnon could give the order. Mason was right behind me, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. We circled around, moving fast, using the terrain to our advantage. The aliens might have been faster, but they didn't know how to fight like we did. Earth had taught us how to fight dirty, how to use every trick in the book. I heard Mason's rifle bark again, saw another alien drop. But more kept coming. They didn't stop, didn't retreat. It was like they were testing us, probing our defenses. "Stay focused," McKinnon's voice came through again, sharp and commanding. "We're not done yet." No, we weren't done. Not by a long shot. The scent was stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, a mix of chemicals and decay, something utterly alien. But it gave them away. I spotted another shimmer, aimed, and fired. The alien crumpled, but there was no time to celebrate. Another shimmer appeared to my right, then another. They were everywhere, and we were running out of time. "Lieutenant Daniels," McKinnon called out. "Fall back to the ridge. We'll hold them there." I glanced over my shoulder, saw the others already pulling back. Mason was still firing, his hands steady despite the chaos around us. "Come on," I shouted, grabbing his arm and dragging him toward the ridge. We moved fast, but the aliens were faster. They closed the distance with alarming speed, their forms becoming more solid as they approached. But we had one last trick up our sleeves. As we reached the ridge, I saw it, the perimeter defenses we'd set up earlier. Simple mines, designed to go off when anything crossed the line. The aliens didn't know about them. They thought they had us cornered, but they were wrong. McKinnon gave the order, and the ground erupted in a series of deafening explosions. The shockwaves sent dirt and debris flying, and the aliens were caught in the blast. Their cloaking devices flickered and failed, revealing their true forms as they collapsed, one by one. The battlefield went silent, save for the ringing in my ears. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. "Earth wasn't a prison," I muttered, staring down at the bodies of the fallen aliens. It was boot camp. The smoke from the explosions had barely cleared when McKinnon's voice crackled over the comms again. "Daniels, get your head on straight. They're regrouping." I snapped out of it, my focus coming back hard and fast. He was right. The aliens weren't finished. Their shimmering forms flickered in the distance, moving like shadows across the broken landscape. We had bought ourselves time, nothing more. "We need a new plan," Mason said beside me, his voice shaking, but his hand steady on his rifle. He'd seen the same thing I had. The aliens had learned from the mines. They wouldn't fall for that again. I scanned the ridge. Behind us, the terrain dipped into a narrow valley, jagged rocks forming natural choke points. If we could lead the aliens into the valley, we might have a chance to thin their numbers. "We funnel them in," I said. "Make them come to us on our terms." McKinnon nodded. "Do it." There was no hesitation. That was one thing I respected about the man. He knew when a plan had legs and when it was time to improvise. "Mason, take point. Daniels, cover the rear. Move out." We moved quickly, boots crunching on the loose dirt. The valley stretched out in front of us like a gaping maw, but it was our best shot. As we ran, I glanced over my shoulder. The aliens were closing in, faster than before. They had adapted, just like we knew they would. "Move faster," I shouted. There wasn't time to admire the scenery or think about what might happen if we failed. We reached the first choke point, a narrow pass barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side. Perfect. McKinnon signaled for us to stop. "Daniels, set the charges." I pulled a small explosive pack from my belt and started planting them along the rocky walls. If we timed it right, we could trap the first wave and force the rest into a bottleneck. "Charges set," I said, stepping back. "We blow it on my mark." The aliens were close now, their shimmering forms almost solid. I could see their strange, shifting bodies, like liquid metal rippling with every movement. They didn't make a sound. No war cries, no screams, just that eerie silence. It was unnerving, but it also made them predictable. "Here they come," Mason muttered, raising his rifle. I watched as the first of the aliens entered the narrow pass. They moved cautiously, wary of another trap, but they had no choice. This was the only way through. More followed, slipping into the choke point like water through a crack. "Now!" I shouted. The charges exploded with a deafening roar, and the walls of the pass collapsed, burying the aliens in a cloud of dust and rubble. The ground shook beneath our feet, but we held our position. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the dust cleared. A few aliens had survived, their forms twisted and broken, but still moving. Mason fired first, dropping one with a clean headshot. I followed suit, squeezing the trigger and watching as the bullets tore through their bodies. These weren't the invisible enemies we had faced before. Now, they were exposed, vulnerable. We kept firing, the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. The aliens fell one by one, their bodies crumpling into heaps of metallic flesh. But more were coming, always more. "We can't hold this position forever," McKinnon said, his voice grim. "We don't have to," I replied, "just long enough." We retreated further into the valley, using the natural terrain to our advantage. The aliens followed, but the choke points slowed them down, forced them to funnel through narrow gaps where we could pick them off one by one. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was working, for now. "How many more do you think there are?" Mason asked between shots, his breathing ragged. "Doesn't matter," McKinnon replied. "We kill them all." It was a simple plan, but that's what made it effective. We didn't need to outthink these aliens, just outlast them. And Earth had taught us how to endure. The fighting continued, the aliens relentless in their assault. But for every one that made it through, we took out two more. My rifle was getting hot in my hands, the barrel glowing faintly from the constant fire. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not until every last one of these things was dead. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, a high-pitched whine, like the scream of a dying animal. I turned, just in time to see one of the aliens lift its head and let out a strange, pulsating shriek. The others stopped, as if listening to some silent command. Then, without warning, they surged forward in a coordinated attack. "Incoming!" I yelled, ducking behind a rock as the aliens swarmed us. They moved faster than before, their bodies blurring with speed. I fired blindly into the mass, hearing the satisfying thud of bodies hitting the ground. But it wasn't enough. They were too close. One of them lunged at me, its arms outstretched. I dodged to the side, feeling the rush of air as its claws sliced through the space where I'd been standing. I raised my rifle, ready to fire, but the alien was faster. It slammed into me, knocking the weapon from my hands. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The alien loomed over me, its liquid metal skin shimmering in the dim light. I reached for my sidearm, but the alien was already moving, its claws coming down toward my throat. Then, out of nowhere, a shot rang out. The alien's head snapped back, and it crumpled to the ground, lifeless. "Get up, Daniels," McKinnon shouted, pulling me to my feet. "We're not done yet." I grabbed my rifle and fell back into position, my heart pounding in my chest. The aliens were pressing harder now, their movements more erratic, more desperate. But we were still holding, barely. "We need to fall back," Mason said, his voice strained. McKinnon shook his head. "No, we stand our ground." I wasn't sure how much longer we could last. My arms were aching, my legs felt like lead, and my vision was starting to blur from the exhaustion. But McKinnon was right. If we fell back now, the aliens would overrun us. So we kept fighting. Minutes blurred into hours, each second stretching out like an eternity. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley. We had been fighting for what felt like days, but the aliens kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. But then, something changed. The aliens stopped. Not all at once, but gradually, their attacks became less coordinated, their movements slower. It was like they were losing strength, losing focus. "What the hell is happening?" Mason asked, his voice thick with disbelief. I didn't have an answer, but I didn't care. The aliens were faltering, and that was all that mattered. McKinnon took advantage of the lull, barking orders to regroup and reload. We moved quickly, restocking our ammo and tending to the wounded. But the question lingered in the back of my mind: why had they stopped? As I watched the remaining aliens retreat into the shadows, I felt a strange sense of unease. This wasn't over. Not yet. McKinnon must have felt it too, because he gave the order to fall back. "We'll regroup at the base camp," he said, his voice grim. "This isn't the end." We moved cautiously, keeping an eye on the shadows as we made our way back through the valley. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by the silence that had fallen over the battlefield. The smell of blood and sweat clung to us, a reminder of the fight we had barely survived. When we finally reached the base camp, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No hum of machinery, no chatter from the comms, just silence. McKinnon frowned, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "Something's not right." I nodded, feeling the same unease settle over me like a weight in my chest. The base camp should have been bustling with activity, but it was eerily still. "Stay alert," McKinnon ordered, his voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into." We approached the camp slowly, weapons drawn. The tents were still standing, the equipment untouched, but there was no sign of the rest of our unit. No bodies, no blood, just nothing. "Where the hell is everyone?" Mason whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. McKinnon signaled for us to spread out, to search the area, but I already knew we wouldn't find anything. Whatever had happened here, it was over long before we arrived. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the silence was broken. A low, guttural sound echoed through the air, sending a shiver down my spine. It was coming from the shadows, from the place where the valley met the horizon. A sound I had never heard before, but instantly recognized. Something was coming. We spread out cautiously, weapons at the ready, our eyes scanning the stillness of the base camp. The place was too quiet, too empty. The faint wind carried the scent of smoke and dirt, but there were no bodies, no signs of a struggle. Just that low, rumbling sound from the shadows beyond the camp, growing louder. I tightened my grip on my rifle, feeling the weight of it steady my nerves. "Mason, take the left flank," McKinnon ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Daniels, you're with me." We moved in formation, our footsteps crunching against the gravel as we advanced toward the source of the sound. Each step felt heavier than the last, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my breathing steady, my focus sharp. We couldn't afford any mistakes now. As we neared the edge of the camp, the rumble turned into something more, a deep, rhythmic pulsing, like the beat of some unseen heart buried in the earth. The shadows ahead seemed to shift, alive with movement, though I couldn't make out any clear shapes, just a sense of something waiting, lurking. Mason, on the left, held his position, his rifle raised, scanning the horizon. "I don't like this," he muttered, his eyes darting from side to side. "It's too quiet." "Stay focused," McKinnon said sharply. "Whatever's out there, we handle it like we always do. No surprises. We've been through worse." I nodded, though my gut told me this was different. We had faced down these aliens before, fought through their tricks, but something had shifted. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a warning. "Contact," Mason hissed. I snapped my head to the left, following his gaze. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Not the shimmering, liquid-like forms we had fought in the valley, but something new. These aliens were bigger, their bodies more solid, with jagged armor plating covering their forms. Their eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, locked onto us with chilling focus. McKinnon didn't hesitate. "Light 'em up," he shouted. We opened fire, the sharp crack of gunshots shattering the stillness. Bullets pinged off the aliens' armor, some finding weak spots and cutting through. They advanced steadily, unfazed by our initial volley. One of them lunged toward Mason, its armored claws swiping dangerously close. Mason rolled out of the way, his rifle firing in controlled bursts, but it wasn't enough to stop them. "They're tougher this time," I shouted over the gunfire. "Aim for the joints," McKinnon ordered, his voice calm but firm. "We've taken them down before, we can do it again." I shifted my aim, targeting the gaps between the aliens' armor plates, where their limbs met their bodies. My next few shots hit home, and one of the creatures stumbled, its leg giving out beneath it. But even on the ground, it crawled forward, relentless. "Daniels, fall back," McKinnon barked. I retreated, firing as I moved, the aliens pressing closer with each second. Mason was already falling back to join us, his face grim but focused. The creatures were adapting again, just like before, but this time we were running out of options. "We need to find cover," Mason said, his voice strained. "We can't hold them off like this." McKinnon nodded, glancing over his shoulder toward the ridge behind the base. "We'll pull back to the rocks. We can use the terrain to slow them down." We moved quickly, retreating up the slope toward the rocks. The aliens followed, but the uneven terrain slowed them just enough for us to keep ahead. I could feel the sweat running down my back, my muscles aching from the strain, but I pushed through it. We had to keep moving. As we reached the rocks, McKinnon signaled for us to take position. "Set up here, we hold the line." I crouched behind a large boulder, my rifle trained on the advancing aliens. They were getting closer, their armored bodies glinting in the fading light. Mason was beside me, his breathing heavy but controlled, his hands steady on his weapon. "They don't stop, do they?" he muttered, glancing at me. "Nope," I replied, lining up my next shot. "But neither do we." The aliens closed in, and we opened fire again. This time, we were more precise, aiming for the vulnerable spots in their armor. One by one, the creatures fell, their bodies hitting the ground with heavy thuds. But for every one we took down, another two seemed to take its place. "We can't hold them off forever," Mason said, his voice tight with frustration. McKinnon didn't respond right away. He was watching the battlefield, his eyes narrowed, calculating. Then he pointed toward a narrow gap between the rocks. "We can funnel them through there. Make them come at us one at a time." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We shifted our position, taking cover near the gap. The aliens, relentless as ever, followed us into the bottleneck. The first one charged through, its armored form barely fitting between the rocks. I fired, my shot hitting it square in the chest. It staggered, but kept coming. I fired again, this time aiming for the joint in its leg. The bullet pierced through, and the creature collapsed to the ground. "Keep it up," McKinnon shouted, his voice ringing out over the sound of gunfire. We held the line, taking down the aliens one by one as they tried to push through the narrow gap. It was a brutal, grinding battle, but it was working. The terrain was slowing them down, giving us just enough of an edge. But even as we fought, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The aliens weren't acting like they had before. They were smarter, more organized, and there was a sense of purpose behind their movements that hadn't been there in the valley. And then it hit me. "They're hurting us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. McKinnon glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "What?" "Look at how they're moving," I said, gesturing toward the aliens. "They're not just attacking us. They're forcing us back, pushing us toward something." McKinnon's face darkened as he processed what I was saying. "Damn it." He scanned the ridge behind us, his eyes narrowing as he saw what I had missed. There, at the top of the ridge, was another group of aliens, larger than the ones we had been fighting. They were waiting, watching, ready to spring their trap. "We've been played," McKinnon growled. "Fall back, now." We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled to our feet, retreating up the slope as fast as we could. The aliens below us surged forward, their pace quickening as they sensed victory. The ones on the ridge began to move as well, closing in from both sides. My heart was pounding in my chest as we ran, the sound of the aliens' footsteps echoing behind us. We were trapped, and there was no way out. But we weren't dead yet. McKinnon led us toward a narrow crevice in the rocks, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "In here," he shouted, gesturing for us to follow him. We slipped into the crevice, the walls pressing in on either side. The aliens were too big to follow us, their bulky forms unable to fit through the narrow gap. For the moment, we were safe. But I knew it wouldn't last. We crawled through the crevice, the darkness closing in around us. The sound of the aliens' growls echoed behind us, but they couldn't reach us. Not yet, anyway. Finally, we emerged on the other side, into a small clearing. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Mason was beside me, his face pale, but his eyes still burning with determination. McKinnon stood over us, his expression hard. "We're not out of this yet," he said, his voice low. "But we're not done fighting either." I nodded, pushing myself to my feet. My body was screaming for rest, but I knew we didn't have time for that. The aliens were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until we were dead. But we weren't dead yet. "What now?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. McKinnon looked out over the clearing, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Now we make them regret ever coming after us." We crouched in the narrow clearing, the quiet unsettling after the chaos of the attack. My heart pounded, but I kept my focus on McKinnon, waiting for his next order. Every second we had was borrowed time. The aliens had herded us into this trap like we were prey, and they weren't far behind. "First things first," McKinnon said, his voice sharp but controlled. "We need to regroup and check ammo. No point moving forward if we can't fight." Mason and I both nodded, quickly checking our remaining rounds. I had a half-spent magazine in my rifle and 2 spares. Not nearly enough. Mason gave a grim look, tapping his last mag against his palm. "Running low," he muttered. McKinnon pulled out a small comm device from his pack and attempted to raise command, but all he got was static. "Damn it," he cursed, tossing the comm back into his pack. "We're cut off." I looked around the clearing, my instincts telling me something was still off. The terrain had given us a brief reprieve, but I knew these aliens weren't done with us. They had planned this ambush carefully. They were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. "What's our next move?" I asked. McKinnon was silent for a moment, scanning the terrain around us. He wasn't the type to make rash decisions, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he spoke. "We move up the ridge, find higher ground. We can't stay here, or they'll pick us off one by one." "And then what?" Mason asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're low on ammo, no comms, and we're outnumbered." McKinnon gave him a hard look. "We improvise. That's what we do." We didn't argue. There was no point. McKinnon's plans were often crazy, but they worked. And right now, we didn't have any other options. The climb up the ridge was slow and grueling. The ground was uneven, and the rocks made it difficult to find good footing. Every step felt like it was taking us deeper into a trap, but we had to keep moving. The aliens weren't far behind, and they would have no trouble navigating this terrain. We moved silently, using the cover of the rocks to mask our movements. My breath was heavy, my body aching from the climb, but I kept going. I had no choice. We all knew what was at stake. When we finally reached the top, we paused, crouching low to stay hidden. The view from the ridge wasn't exactly encouraging. Below us, the alien forces were gathering. I could see at least 24 of them, their armored forms glinting in the dim light. They moved with purpose, organizing into tight formations. This wasn't just a random attack anymore. This was something bigger. "They're getting ready for something," Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," I agreed, watching as the aliens formed ranks. "This isn't just a skirmish. They're preparing for a full assault." McKinnon didn't respond right away. He was focused, his eyes scanning the enemy movements. I knew that look. He was already planning, calculating the odds, and I could tell by his expression that the odds weren't in our favor. "We need a diversion," he finally said. "Something to slow them down, give us a chance to regroup." "A diversion?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of diversion?" McKinnon gave a tight smile. "The kind that makes a lot of noise and buys us time. We hit their supplies, take out their comms. They'll have to pull back to deal with the damage." Mason frowned. "That's risky. We'd have to get right into the middle of their camp. One wrong move and we're dead." "You got a better idea?" McKinnon shot back. Mason didn't answer. McKinnon pulled a small explosive charge from his pack and handed it to me. "You're the fastest. You'll plant this on their comms tower while Mason and I create a distraction. Once it blows, we regroup back here." I nodded, gripping the charge tightly. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of sneaking into the middle of the enemy camp, but McKinnon's plan made sense. If we could take out their comms, we could throw their entire operation into chaos. We waited until the aliens' patrols shifted, then moved quickly and quietly down the ridge. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. Every step had to be precise. One wrong move, one misplaced footstep, and we'd be spotted. McKinnon and Mason veered off to the left, heading toward the supply depot, while I continued straight toward the comms tower. The closer I got, the more I could feel the tension building in my chest. The tower loomed above me, guarded by two of the armored aliens. They were alert, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. I crouched low behind a stack of crates, my breath shallow as I assessed the situation. I needed to move fast, but I also needed to be smart. One wrong move and those guards would tear me apart. I waited for the right moment, watching as the guards shifted positions. When their backs were turned, I darted forward, my feet silent against the dirt. I reached the base of the tower and quickly attached the explosive charge, setting the timer for 30 seconds. The moment the charge was in place, I turned and sprinted back toward the ridge, my heart racing. I could hear the distant sounds of McKinnon and Mason's diversion, gunfire and shouts echoing through the camp. The aliens were distracted, their attention focused on the chaos. They didn't notice me slipping away. Just as I reached the cover of the rocks, the explosion ripped through the air. The comms tower went up in a massive fireball, debris raining down on the camp. The aliens scattered, their formations breaking as they scrambled to respond to the sudden attack. I slid into position beside McKinnon and Mason, who were both breathing heavily but unharmed. "Nice work," McKinnon said, nodding toward the explosion. "That should slow them down," I replied, trying to catch my breath. McKinnon's eyes were sharp as he scanned the chaos below. "We're not out of this yet," he said, his tone serious. "But we've bought ourselves some time." Mason reloaded his rifle, glancing toward the ridge. "What now?" McKinnon didn't hesitate. "We head for the evac point. We've done enough damage here. Time to regroup with the others." We moved quickly, taking advantage of the confusion in the enemy camp. The aliens were still disorganized, their comms down and their supply lines in shambles. But we knew it wouldn't last. They'd regroup soon, and when they did, they'd come after us with everything they had. As we made our way toward the evac point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The aliens had been too well prepared, too organized. This wasn't just a random encounter. There was something bigger at play here, something we hadn't seen yet. But there was no time to dwell on it. We had a mission to complete, and right now, survival was our only priority. The ridge gave way to a dense forest, the trees offering some cover as we moved deeper into the wilderness. The sounds of the alien forces faded behind us, but we didn't let our guard down. We couldn't afford to. After what felt like hours of running, we finally reached the evac point. It was a small clearing, just large enough for a shuttle to land. McKinnon raised his comm, trying to reach command again. This time, the signal went through. "This is Alpha Team," he said into the comm. "We've completed our objective and are awaiting extraction. Ida on the shuttle?" There was a brief pause, then a voice crackled through the comm. "Copy that, Alpha Team. Shuttle is inbound. Eat at 10 minutes. Hold your position." McKinnon lowered the comm and looked at us. "We hold here until extraction. Stay sharp." We spread out, taking up defensive positions around the clearing. My body was exhausted, my muscles aching from the nonstop action, but I forced myself to stay alert. The aliens could still be out there, and we couldn't let our guard down now. Minutes passed in tense silence. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, a stark contrast to the chaos of the battlefield we had just left behind. I kept my rifle trained on the tree line, my eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint hum of the shuttle's engines. Relief washed over me, but I didn't lower my guard. Not yet. We weren't safe until we were off this planet. The shuttle appeared over the ridge, descending toward the clearing. McKinnon raised his comm again. "Shuttle in sight. Prepare for extraction." Just as the shuttle touched down, I saw it, movement in the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I raised my rifle, but it was too late. The aliens had found us. The first signs of movement came from the trees to the left. I barely had time to signal before the alien forces broke through the tree line, rushing toward us in a tight formation. Their movements were precise, practiced. We'd hit them hard, but they hadn't been crippled. I ducked behind a nearby rock as plasma fire ripped through the clearing. The noise was deafening, but I forced myself to stay calm, lining up my first shot. McKinnon's voice came through the comms, sharp and clear. "Hold position. Focus fire on their left flank." I pulled the trigger, watching as the lead alien dropped. I didn't waste time celebrating. My hands moved automatically, reloading as I shifted to the next target. Mason was beside me, firing rapidly, his eyes locked on the advancing enemy. His shots were hitting their mark, but there were too many of them. They kept coming. The shuttle's engines roared behind us, but it wasn't ready yet. The extraction point was turning into a war zone, and if we didn't hold them back, we'd be overrun before we could make it out. "They're trying to box us in," Mason growled, ducking as plasma bolts whizzed past his head. McKinnon was already moving, shifting positions to throw off their targeting. "Stay mobile. Don't let them pin us down." I nodded, moving to a new spot behind a tree. I took a breath, then aimed again, squeezing the trigger. Another alien went down, but I could see more of them circling around, trying to cut off our escape route. The situation was getting worse by the second. My mind raced, calculating the distance to the shuttle and the number of enemies still standing. We didn't have time for a prolonged fight. We needed to move now. "We can't hold this much longer," I shouted into the comms. McKinnon's voice was steady, even in the chaos. "Just a few more minutes. Keep firing." I gritted my teeth, focusing on the task at hand. My shots were more controlled now, each one finding a target. But the aliens were relentless. They were better trained than we'd given them credit for, and they weren't backing down. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire from the shuttle's mounted turret tore through the enemy ranks, giving us a momentary advantage. I took the opportunity to reload, my hands moving quickly as I ducked behind cover. "Shuttle's ready for takeoff," the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "Get on board, now." McKinnon didn't hesitate. "Move, everyone, fall back to the shuttle." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted toward the shuttle, firing over my shoulder as I ran. Plasma bolts slammed into the ground around me, but I kept moving, my legs burning with the effort. Mason was right behind me, covering our retreat as we made a mad dash for the ramp. McKinnon was the last one on board, firing his rifle until the moment he jumped onto the ramp. The shuttle's doors slammed shut, and I collapsed against the wall, panting for breath. The shuttle lifted off, the sound of its engines drowning out the noise of the battle below. We had made it, barely. I glanced at McKinnon, who was leaning against the opposite wall, reloading his rifle even though the fight was over. His face was grim, but there was a spark of satisfaction in his eyes. "Good work," he said, looking around at all of us. "We got the job done." Mason let out a shaky breath, slumping down next to me. "That was too close," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. I couldn't argue with him. The mission had been a success, but it had come at a high cost. We'd taken out their comms and disrupted their supply lines, but we'd barely made it out alive. "What now?" I asked, looking at McKinnon. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the shuttle's window, watching as the landscape below us faded into the distance. "We head back to base. This isn't over." I didn't need to ask what he meant. The aliens had been prepared for us, too prepared. This wasn't just a random encounter. They had been waiting for us, and that meant there was more going on than we realized. But for now, all I cared about was the fact that we were alive. I leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a deep exhaustion. My muscles ached, my mind was foggy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The shuttle's comm system crackled to life again, this time with a message from command. "Alpha Team, this is HQ. Good work on the mission. We'll debrief you when you get back. Prepare for immediate redeployment." I opened my eyes, glancing at McKinnon. "Redeployment? Already?" He nodded, his expression unreadable. "They don't want us resting. We're too valuable. Something big is happening, and they need us in the field." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. There was no rest for the weary, apparently. The shuttle ride back to base was quiet. No one spoke, and I was grateful for the silence. We all needed time to process what had happened, to recover from the intensity of the fight. But even as I sat there, staring at the walls of the shuttle, my mind was already racing ahead. What were the aliens planning? How had they known we were coming? There were too many unanswered questions, and I didn't like it. Not one bit. When we finally touched down at base, the debriefing was quick and to the point. Command wanted to know what we had seen, what we had encountered, but there wasn't much time for details. We were being sent back out, this time with reinforcements. McKinnon and I exchanged a glance as we geared up for the next mission. There was an unspoken understanding between us. This was bigger than any of us had realized. "Stay sharp," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "We've only just started." I nodded, tightening the straps on my gear. "Let's get it done." And just like that, we were back in the fight. The next mission felt different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense that things were escalating faster than we could keep up with. The aliens were getting bolder, their attacks more coordinated, and it wasn't just us they were after anymore. As we moved through the dense terrain, the weight of the situation settled over me like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping something bigger, something that threatened everything we had fought for. McKinnon's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. "Eyes up. We've got movement ahead." I raised my rifle, scanning the tree line. Sure enough, there were shadows moving in the distance, too many to count. My heart rate quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was what we were trained for. As the enemy forces came into view, I tightened my grip on my rifle. This wasn't going to be easy, but we didn't have a choice. We had to keep fighting. We hit the ground running. The drop zone was a narrow stretch of flat terrain, bordered by dense forest on either side. No cover, no time to think. McKinnon's hand was on my shoulder, pulling me forward, his voice clear and urgent. "Move, we're sitting ducks here." I followed, keeping low, rifle up, eyes scanning for movement. The others were spread out behind us, forming a loose line. Mason was to my left, breathing hard but steady, his grip firm on his weapon. The rest of the squad had fallen into place, keeping pace as we pushed toward the tree line. "Contact," Mason's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. I turned just in time to see the flash of light, plasma fire. The first shot hit the ground near my feet, sending up a spray of dirt and heat. I threw myself to the side, rolling into the cover of a nearby boulder. McKinnon was already in position behind a fallen tree, his rifle up and firing. "Engage. Take them down." I peeked around the rock, my heart racing as I took in the situation. There were at least a dozen of them, moving in from the north, their rifles trained on us. They were fast, but we had the advantage of position. We were ready. I lined up my shot, took a breath, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was familiar, the sound of the shot sharp in the air. The nearest enemy went down, his body crumpling to the ground. The squad opened fire, a coordinated burst of gunfire that pushed the enemy back. Mason was next to me now, his focus absolute as he picked off one target after another. "We can't stay here," he muttered between shots. "They'll overwhelm us." I knew he was right. The enemy was regrouping, and more were coming from the tree line. We had to move, but we couldn't just run. Not yet. McKinnon was already on it. "Mason, Greenwich, flank left. Lay down cover fire. We'll move on your signal." We nodded in unison. No questions, no hesitation. This was what we were trained for. I moved quickly, staying low as I made my way to the left, my eyes locked on the enemy. Mason was right behind me, his rifle spitting out rounds to keep them pinned down. Once we were in position, I fired a quick burst at the lead alien, forcing him to duck behind cover. "Now," I yelled into the comms. McKinnon didn't need to be told twice. He signaled the rest of the squad, and they moved as one, sprinting across the open ground toward the cover of the trees. The enemy tried to follow, but Mason and I kept them pinned down, our rifles cutting through the air with precise shots. It wasn't perfect. We'd taken a hit or two, but nothing fatal. We were in control. "We need to keep moving," McKinnon said as we regrouped behind a large tree. "They're going to keep coming." I wiped the sweat from my forehead, my muscles already starting to ache from the exertion. But there was no time to rest. "Which way?" I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. McKinnon pulled up the map on his wrist display, glancing at it for a moment before pointing to the east. "There's a ridge about 2 clicks that way. If we can get to higher ground, we can hold them off until extraction." Mason nodded. "Let's move." We started moving again, staying low and quiet as we pushed through the dense underbrush. The forest was thick here, the trees close together, providing some cover, but also making it harder to see what was ahead. The sound of the enemy's pursuit faded behind us, but I knew they weren't far. They were regrouping, planning their next move. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the path ahead. We were close now, just another few minutes, and we'd be at the ridge. And then, without warning, the ground beneath my feet exploded. I was thrown backward, my body hitting the dirt hard. My ears rang, the sound of the explosion deafening. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The world spun around me, and I struggled to get my bearings. When the dust cleared, I saw the crater where I had been standing. I had narrowly avoided stepping on a landmine. My head pounded, and I felt the dull throb of pain in my side where debris had hit me. But I was alive, somehow. McKinnon's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. "You good?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if he could see me. "Yeah, close call." Mason helped me to my feet, his expression grim. "They're trying to slow us down." McKinnon looked around, his eyes scanning the trees. "We're running out of time. Keep moving. Watch your step." We pressed on, more cautious now, checking the ground for traps as we made our way toward the ridge. The terrain was rougher here, the incline steep, but we pushed through it, knowing that we couldn't afford to stop. Finally, we reached the top of the ridge, the high ground we needed to make our stand. From here, we had a clear view of the forest below and the path the enemy would have to take to reach us. McKinnon set up the defensive perimeter, positioning us behind rocks and fallen trees, our rifles trained on the tree line. We didn't have long before the enemy would be on us again. "Hold the line," McKinnon said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not letting them take this hill." The tension was palpable. We all knew what was coming. The enemy was regrouping, and this would be their final push. If we could hold them off here, we might just make it out alive. And then they came. They moved fast, but we were ready. The moment they broke through the tree line, we opened fire. The sound of gunfire filled the air, loud and unrelenting. I focused on my targets, my fingers squeezing the trigger again and again, each shot carefully aimed. One by one, the aliens fell, but they kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. I glanced at McKinnon, who was firing in controlled bursts, his face set in grim determination. "We can't hold them off forever," I said between shots. He didn't look at me, his focus on the enemy. "We don't need forever, just long enough." I knew what he meant. Extraction was close, just a few more minutes. But those minutes felt like an eternity as the enemy forces continued to push forward, relentless in their assault. Mason was beside me, his breathing ragged as he reloaded his rifle. "This is getting bad," he muttered. I couldn't disagree. The situation was spiraling out of control, and we were running low on ammo. The enemy was closing in, and we were outnumbered. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. And then, just as it seemed like we were about to be overrun, the sound of engines filled the air. The extraction team had arrived. "Go!" McKinnon shouted, signaling for us to fall back to the shuttle. "Move, move, move." We didn't need to be told twice. I fired one last shot, then turned and sprinted toward the shuttle, my heart pounding in my chest. Mason was right behind me, his face set in determination. We reached the shuttle just as the enemy broke through our lines, their plasma fire lighting up the air around us. But we made it, barely. The shuttle's doors slammed shut, and the engines roared to life. The shuttle shuddered as it rose through the thick atmosphere, the engines straining against the pull of gravity. Inside, the cabin was filled with the sharp scent of sweat and burnt plasma. McKinnon was already moving, strapping himself into a seat near the cockpit, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands. He didn't look at anyone, his focus entirely on the mission ahead. I slumped against the metal wall, my heart rate finally slowing as the adrenaline started to fade. Mason dropped into the seat beside me, wiping the grime from his face with his sleeve. His eyes were wide, still processing the chaos we'd just survived. "That was too close," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the shuttle's engines. "I thought they had us." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. My body ached from the blast, and the close call with the mine replayed in my mind, over and over. I'd almost been turned to a smear of red dirt. But we were still here, barely. "They're getting smarter," McKinnon said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, measured. "They're adapting." I knew what he meant. The aliens weren't just mindless soldiers anymore. Their tactics were evolving, their coordination improving. That ambush was precise, planned. Someone was pulling the strings, and it wasn't just the rank-and-file grunts we'd been dealing with. The shuttle jolted slightly, a reminder that we weren't safe yet. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "ETA to base, 10 minutes. Brace for turbulence." McKinnon stood up, moving toward the cockpit. His voice was low, but the tone carried enough weight to get our attention. "We'll be debriefed as soon as we land. Get your head straight." Mason glanced at me, his expression serious. "What do you think that was about? The mine, the ambush. It didn't feel random." "It wasn't," I said, wiping the sweat from my brow. "They knew where we'd be. Someone's feeding them intel." Mason cursed under his breath, leaning back in his seat. "Damn. We barely made it out this time. What happens when they catch us again?" "We don't let them," I said, meeting his gaze. "We adapt too." McKinnon stepped back into the cabin, giving us a look that ended the conversation. He strapped in, his face unreadable. The rest of the ride was silent, the only sound the hum of the engines and the occasional static from the pilot's updates. When the shuttle finally touched down, the door slid open, and a blast of cool air rushed in. We unstrapped and stood, weapons slung over our shoulders, exhaustion settling into our bones. The base stretched out in front of us, a series of fortified buildings and bunkers, the perimeter lined with heavy artillery and watchtowers. A group of soldiers met us at the landing pad, their faces grim. One of them, an officer with a sharp, weathered face, approached McKinnon. "Commander, you're needed in the command center immediately. Debriefing." His eyes shifted to the rest of us. You too. McKinnon nodded, his face tight with barely concealed frustration. All right, move out. We followed in silence, our boots echoing against the metal floor as we walked through the halls of the base. The command center was bustling with activity, officers barking orders, analysts studying holographic maps, the hum of machines constantly feeding data. It was a controlled chaos, the kind you get used to in a war zone. We were led into a small briefing room at the back of the center. The lights were dim, and the air smelled faintly of old coffee. A large display screen dominated one wall, showing a map of the region we'd just come from. The officer motioned for us to take our seats. Once we were settled, the door slid open again, and a figure stepped in. General Lawson. His presence filled the room immediately. Broad shoulders, gray hair cut close to his scalp, and sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. He wasted no time. I've read the report, he said, his voice firm but measured. You encountered a resistance far more organized than we anticipated. We've seen signs of this for a while now, but what happened out there today confirms it. He gestured to the screen, and the map zoomed in, highlighting a cluster of red dots. This region is crawling with their forces, but what we didn't know until today was how coordinated they've become. They've shifted tactics, faster responses, better coordination, and now, the mines. I glanced at McKinnon, who was sitting stone-faced, his eyes locked on the map. We believe there's a new command element, Lawson continued. Someone is pulling the strings, organizing these attacks. It's not random anymore. Mason shifted in his seat. So what's the play, sir? We barely got out of there. Lawson's gaze shifted to him, then back to the map. The play is simple. We find whoever is leading these forces, and we take them out. If we can cut off their head, the body will fall. McKinnon leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but tense. You think it's one of the warlords, or something else? Lawson's expression darkened. We don't know. That's why you're going back in. The room went silent. Back in? I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. We barely made it out alive. Lawson's eyes met mine, unwavering. That's why you're the ones going back. You've seen it firsthand. You know what to expect. Mason let out a sharp breath. With all due respect, sir, what if we're walking into another trap? We don't have enough intel. Lawson cut him off, his voice firm. That's why this time, you won't be going alone. We've put together a strike team, elite units from across the sector. You'll have all the backup you need, but we need this done. Fast. The tension in the room was thick. McKinnon nodded, his voice steady. What's the objective? Lawson turned back to the screen, highlighting a new location. There's a facility deep in their territory. We believe it's where their leader is operating from. We're sending you in to confirm the intel and, if possible, neutralize the target. This mission is critical. If we don't stop them now, they'll overrun our entire front. I felt the weight of his words settle over me. This wasn't just another mission. This was the turning point. You'll have 24 hours to prepare, Lawson said, his gaze moving over each of us. Get your gear in order, brief your teams, and rest while you can. Dismissed. We stood, our minds already shifting to the mission ahead. As we made our way out of the command center, the weight of what was coming settled in my gut. This was going to be the hardest fight yet. Back in the barracks, we sat in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. Mason cleaned his rifle, the rhythmic sound of the brush against the barrel, the only noise in the room. McKinnon sat at the small desk, going over maps and mission details, his face hard and focused. I leaned back on my bunk, staring at the ceiling. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't stop running through every possible scenario. What we'd face out there, what we might not come back from. Mason finally broke the silence. You think we'll make it? I glanced over at him. His hands were steady, but his voice had that edge, the one that only comes when you're staring down something bigger than you've ever faced. We don't have a choice, I said simply. We make it, or we don't. He nodded, understanding what I wasn't saying. We didn't do this because we thought we'd make it out alive. We did it because there was no one else who could. Sleep while you can, McKinnon said without looking up from his maps. Tomorrow, everything changes. I closed my eyes, willing my mind to quiet down, but the weight of the mission pressed heavy on my chest. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting for the whole damn war. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The following morning came too quickly. We were up before dawn, gearing up in the darkened barracks. The air was thick with the quiet tension of men who knew the fight ahead would be the hardest one yet. There wasn't any chatter, no small talk, just the sound of weapons being prepped, armor straps tightening, and boots hitting the floor. Mason secured his rifle with methodical precision, checking it twice before strapping it across his back. McKinnon was already suited up, helmet tucked under his arm, scanning over the mission briefing one last time on his data pad. I pulled on my chest plate, feeling the familiar weight settle on my shoulders. My hands moved on autopilot, tightening the straps on my gear, checking my sidearm, loading fresh mags. 5 minutes till we move out, McKinnon announced, his voice cutting through the silence. Grab what you need, double-check your kit. No mistakes today. I didn't need to be told twice. I moved to my locker, pulling out the last of my supplies, extra ammo, grenades, a combat knife. I stuffed them into my vest, feeling the familiar bulge of weight, but not minding. It was comforting, like armor against the unknown waiting for us. The door to the barracks slid open, and a new figure stepped in. Lieutenant Hargrave. She was leading the strike team that would be backing us up, hardened vets, handpicked from the best units across the sector. Her face was set in a no-nonsense expression, her posture rigid as she addressed McKinnon. Teams prepped and ready. We'll meet you at the launch bay in 5. McKinnon nodded, giving her a brief acknowledgement before turning back to us. You heard her. Let's move. We fell in line behind him, filing out of the barracks and into the cold morning air. The base was already bustling with activity. Personnel were moving in every direction, prepping for the day's operations. We cut through it all, heading straight for the launch bay. The strike team was already there, standing by their drop ships, fully suited and ready to move. The ship assigned to us sat in the middle of the bay, engines humming softly as the crew made final checks. It wasn't the same shuttle we'd used before. This one was bigger, heavier, built for combat. The rear ramp was down, and we boarded without hesitation, taking our places in the cramped space inside. Once seated, McKinnon keyed into his comm. All units, check in. One by one, voices crackled over the line, confirming readiness. Hargrave's team was in position, and the pilots were ready. The final signal came through, and the ramp began to close. Strap in, McKinnon ordered, his tone hard. This is going to be rough. The engines roared to life, and the ship shuddered as it lifted off the ground. My stomach dropped as we ascended, the base shrinking away beneath us. The ride was smooth at first, but we all knew that wouldn't last. The further we got into enemy territory, the rougher it would get. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense. No one said a word. Mason sat across from me, his hands gripping the sides of his seat, eyes focused straight ahead. His jaw was clenched tight, the way it always was before a mission like this. McKinnon was leaning forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the display in front of him, monitoring our approach. The minutes dragged on. The hum of the engines, the faint rattle of the hull, it all blended together, creating a dull background noise that did nothing to ease the tension. I forced myself to breathe steady, trying to keep my mind clear. No room for second-guessing now. We were committed. The first sign of trouble came about 20 minutes into the flight. The ship jerked violently to the side, throwing us against our restraints. Red lights flashed in the cabin, and the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Taking fire. Hold on. I gripped the seat tighter as the ship banked hard, dodging whatever was coming at us. The sound of rapid gunfire filled the air, sharp and mechanical, as the rear gunner returned fire. Another violent lurch, and we were diving low, skimming the tops of trees as we tried to avoid enemy anti-aircraft fire. McKinnon's voice cut through the chaos, calm and focused. "Stay sharp, we're almost there." The ship shook again, harder this time, and I could hear the distinct sound of something hitting the hull. The gunners were firing non-stop now, trying to keep the enemies at bay. Through the small viewport, I caught glimpses of the landscape below, dense forests, mountains in the distance, and the dark silhouette of the facility we were heading toward. "Final approach," the pilot shouted. The ship dropped lower, the trees blurring past us as we descended toward the landing zone. The fire from the enemy was relentless now, but we were close, too close for them to take us down. I could feel the ship straining against the barrage, but it held together. Finally, with a hard jolt, we touched down. The ramp dropped immediately, and McKinnon was the first out, rifle raised. "Move, move, move." We didn't hesitate. I was on my feet, running down the ramp and into the thick cover of the trees. Mason was right behind me, followed by the rest of the team. The strike unit spread out, securing the perimeter as we regrouped. Hargrave's voice came over the comm. "Perimeter clear for now. No visual on enemy forces, but they're close. Keep moving." McKinnon motioned for us to follow, and we pushed forward into the dense forest. The air was heavy, the thick canopy above casting everything in shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my mind was clear, focused. Every step had to be precise. We couldn't afford mistakes. As we moved deeper into the forest, the terrain became rougher, steep inclines, rocky outcrops, and thick underbrush that made progress slow. But McKinnon led us through it without hesitation, his eyes scanning constantly, his movements deliberate. We were about a mile from the facility when the first sign of trouble appeared. Hargrave's team, who had been moving parallel to us, suddenly came over the comm. "Contact! We've got hostiles, 4, maybe 5, closing in from the north." McKinnon immediately raised his fist, signaling us to halt. "Copy that. Everyone stay low and hold position. We'll flank them." We crouched down, rifles ready, eyes scanning the surrounding forest. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own breath, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, but nothing else. The tension was suffocating. Then, out of nowhere, the crack of gunfire erupted. Mason fired first, taking down a figure that had appeared through the brush, moving fast. Another shot rang out, then another. I saw a second enemy, moving fast to the left, and squeezed the trigger. He dropped without a sound. The firefight was quick and brutal. They came at us hard, but we held our ground, taking them down one by one. The strike team moved in from the flank, catching the enemy off guard, and within minutes it was over. 5 bodies lay scattered on the forest floor, their weapons still smoking. McKinnon surveyed the area, his face unreadable. "Anyone hurt?" Mason shook his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We're good." "Move out," McKinnon ordered, his voice tight. "We're close. No more delays." We pressed on, the facility looming ahead in the distance. My muscles ached from the strain of the climb, but I pushed through it. There was no time for fatigue, no room for hesitation. As we neared the facility, we dropped low, moving in a tight formation. The entrance was heavily guarded, just as we'd expected, automated turrets, patrols moving in synchronized patterns. McKinnon raised a hand, signaling us to stop. "Here's the plan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hargrave's team will take out the turrets. We'll move in once they're down. No mistakes. We hit hard, we hit fast, and we don't stop until we've secured the target." "Understood." We all nodded, checking our weapons one last time. My heart was racing again, the adrenaline kicking back in. This was it. The mission we'd been dreading since the moment we left the base. McKinnon gave the signal, and Hargrave's team moved in. Shots rang out in the distance, followed by the sudden silence of the turrets going offline. Without a word, we moved forward, closing the distance to the facility. The patrols were next. We took them down quickly, efficiently, moving in sync. There was no time for hesitation, no room for error. Every step was calculated, every shot precise. The facility loomed closer, the entrance now just a few yards away. McKinnon keyed into his comm. "We're in position. Moving in now." The doors slid open, and we stepped into the darkness of the enemy stronghold. The air inside the facility was stale, thick with a smell of metal and machinery. Dim emergency lights cast shadows across the walls, giving the place a claustrophobic feel. The low hum of generators was a constant reminder that we were deep within enemy territory, and the adrenaline still coursed through me, keeping my senses sharp. McKinnon led us through a narrow corridor, rifle raised, eyes scanning every corner. We moved as a tight unit, keeping low and quiet, our footsteps muffled against the metal floor. My heartbeat echoed in my ears as we advanced, knowing the moment we stepped into the main area, we would be exposed. "Contact ahead," Mason whispered, pointing toward a junction where the corridor split. "Looks like 2 guards." McKinnon nodded. "I'll take the left. Mason, you're on the right. The rest of you, cover us." We positioned ourselves, weapons aimed down the corridor. My fingers tightened around the grip of my rifle, the anticipation heavy in the air. McKinnon moved first, slipping around the corner, and I followed suit, Mason right behind me. The guards were facing away from us, engrossed in a conversation. McKinnon raised his weapon, and with a quick, silent motion, he dropped the first guard before the second could react. Mason was on him instantly, the guard's eyes widening in surprise as he was taken down. "Clear," McKinnon said, stepping over the bodies. "Keep moving." We pressed on, adrenaline keeping our pace swift. As we moved deeper, the sounds of distant machinery began to drown out the silence, punctuated by the occasional beep of equipment or the murmur of voices. Hargrave's team was still providing cover from their position, but we knew that would change once we reached the control room. We reached a heavy steel door labeled Control Center. McKinnon signaled for us to halt. "We'll breach this door. Hargrave, can your team cover us?" "Copy that," she replied through the comms. "We've got your 6. McKinnon turned back to us. "On 3? 1, 2, 3. He kicked the door hard, and it flew open, slamming against the wall. The control room was lit by monitors displaying a maze of data and maps. A group of 4 enemy soldiers was huddled around a console, caught off guard by our sudden entrance. "Contact!" McKinnon shouted, firing off 2 quick rounds. I followed suit, sending rounds into the chaos. The soldiers scrambled for their weapons, but we were faster. The room erupted into chaos. Gunfire rang out, bouncing off the metal walls. I ducked behind a console, heart racing as I reloaded. I could see McKinnon and Mason working together, flanking one side while the rest of us covered the other. A burst of gunfire came from my left, and I barely had time to react. I saw one of our guys go down, clutching his side as he hit the ground. Mason moved to drag him behind cover, returning fire as he did. "We've got to secure this room," McKinnon shouted. "Push forward." We pressed hard, moving closer to the enemy positions. I took aim and fired again, taking out another enemy soldier who was trying to regroup. The smoke from the gunfire stung my eyes, but I blinked through it, focusing on the fight. The battle felt like it stretched on forever, but it was only a matter of minutes before the last of the enemy soldiers fell. Silence settled in the control room, broken only by the heavy breathing of our team. "Status?" McKinnon called, his eyes scanning the room. Mason glanced over at the downed soldier. "He's hit, but still breathing. I'll get him stabilized." Hargrave stepped in, assessing the situation. "We need to secure this area and get the intel. Can we access the main systems from here?" McKinnon nodded, moving to the main console. "I'll see what I can pull up." As he began to type, I turned to the rest of the team, my mind racing. "We need to set up a perimeter. They'll send reinforcements." The remaining members moved quickly to check the exits, securing the door behind us and watching the corridor for any signs of incoming enemies. The tension in the room remained palpable. We all knew what was at stake. A few moments later, McKinnon looked up, his expression serious. I've got the layout of the facility. It's larger than we thought. We need to get to the core server room to access the main data. What about our downed guy? I asked, glancing back at Mason, who was now applying a bandage. He'll hold for now, but we can't waste time, Mason replied, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. We have to move. Then let's go, McKinnon commanded, reloading his weapon. Hargrave, you're on point. We'll follow behind. We all nodded, adrenaline still pumping through our veins as we prepared to push deeper into the facility. Hargrave led the way, her rifle ready as we filed out of the control room and into the hallway. The corridors were dark, lit only by flickering lights overhead. Each step felt weighted, as if the air itself was heavy with the anticipation of what lay ahead. We moved cautiously, alert for any signs of movement. As we rounded a corner, we heard it, a loud crash, followed by shouts. McKinnon motioned for us to halt, and we dropped to the ground, weapons raised. It sounded like a group of soldiers coming our way. They're close, McKinnon whispered, his eyes narrowed. Prepare for contact. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the metal walls. My heart raced. This was the moment we had trained for, the reason we had come this far. I could feel the tension building, and I took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. Suddenly, the first soldier rounded the corner, and I squeezed the trigger, dropping him before he could raise his weapon. Chaos erupted as the rest of the group poured into the corridor, firing wildly in our direction. Get back, move, McKinnon shouted, and we all dove for cover, returning fire as fast as we could. The hallway was filled with gunfire, and the air crackled with energy. I ducked behind a metal support beam, trying to steady my aim. One of the enemy soldiers took a hit and fell to the ground, but two more moved up, trying to flank us. I turned to Mason, who was crouched next to me. We need to fall back to the control room, I yelled over the din of battle. No, we can't. They'll push us back, Mason replied, his eyes darting around. We continued to fire, suppressing the enemy, but it was clear they were well prepared. I caught a glimpse of their formation. They were moving to cut us off. Hargrave, we need backup, McKinnon called, his voice strained. We can't hold them much longer. I'm on it, she shouted, signaling her team to take position. With a quick gesture, Hargrave motioned for two of her men to lay down suppressing fire, while she and another soldier moved around the flank. The situation was fluid, shifting from one moment to the next as we fought to maintain our ground. Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the hallway. The shockwave knocked me off balance, sending me crashing to the floor. I struggled to push myself up, blinking through the haze. My ears rang from the blast, and the lights flickered violently. Get up, Mason yelled, helping me to my feet. The chaos was overwhelming. I could see smoke rising from where the explosion had been, and the enemy soldiers were momentarily disoriented. This was our chance. Now, push forward, McKinnon ordered, and we all surged ahead, weapons raised, determination in our eyes. We stormed past the wreckage, the enemy soldiers scrambling to regain their composure. Hargrave's team moved in beside us, taking out one soldier after another as we pressed toward the exit. The core server room is just ahead, McKinnon shouted, pointing down the corridor. As we moved toward it, I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. We had come too far to turn back now. The facility was beginning to feel more like a labyrinth, with danger lurking around every corner. We reached the door to the server room, but it was sealed tight. McKinnon tried to access the controls, but they were locked down. We need to breach it, he said, scanning the area for options. Mason, any ideas? Mason was checking the layout on his data pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. There's an emergency access panel on the side. It might let us override the lock. Let's do it, McKinnon replied. Cover us while we work on it. As we prepared for another wave of enemy soldiers, I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. We had to get inside and access the intel. Mason moved to the panel, pulling off the cover and working quickly. I kept my eyes on the corridor, waiting for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Almost there," Mason muttered, fingers flying over the controls. I glanced back at McKinnon, who was focused on the entrance, ready for any incoming threats. The rest of our team was positioned strategically, weapons drawn, waiting for the moment we'd have to fight again. Come on," Mason urged, and I could feel my heart race in sync with his words. The seconds felt like hours. The enemy was regrouping, and we could hear their voices in the distance. It was only a matter of time before they charged at us again. "Done," Mason exclaimed, a triumphant grin on his face as the door slid open. "Go," McKinnon shouted, and we flooded into the server room. The space was filled with rows of servers, humming quietly, the screens displaying endless streams of data. It was a treasure trove of intel, the information we needed to turn the tide in this battle. "Start downloading everything you can," McKinnon commanded. "We don't have long." We spread out, moving quickly through the aisles, accessing the terminals and initiating downloads. My fingers raced over the keyboard, the data pouring in, but I could hear the sounds of footsteps approaching again. "They're coming," I called out, glancing back at Mason and Hargrave. "We can't leave until this is done," Mason replied, eyes fixed on his terminal. "We need at least a few minutes." "We might not have that long," I insisted, my heart pounding. The door behind us rattled, and I could see shadows moving outside. They were right on our heels. "Get ready," McKinnon yelled, positioning himself near the entrance, rifle at the ready. "Just a little more," Mason shouted, fingers flying over the keyboard, the download progress bar slowly inching forward. I could feel the tension building as we braced ourselves for the incoming assault. The door exploded inward, and a flood of enemy soldiers rushed into the room, guns raised. "Fire!" McKinnon shouted, and we all opened fire, the room filling with gunfire and chaos once again. I took aim at the closest soldier, my finger tightening on the trigger. The adrenaline surged through me, and I couldn't think about anything except the fight at hand. "Keep them back," Hargrave yelled, firing shot after shot. The room became a battleground, the clatter of gunfire echoing against the metal walls. The screens flickered in the chaos, reflecting the battle in bright flashes of light. "Almost there," Mason cried, determination etched on his face as he continued the download. I ducked behind a server, taking a moment to breathe, but I couldn't let myself be distracted. I focused back on the enemy soldiers, firing again as they pressed in. "This is it," McKinnon yelled, the intensity of the moment making his voice rise above the chaos. As the last soldier fell, I looked over at Mason. "Is it done?" "Just a few more seconds," he shouted, eyes locked on the screen. We were on the brink of securing vital information that could turn the tide, but the enemy was relentless. I could see more coming from down the hallway, their footsteps echoing as they charged toward us. "Prepare for more," I yelled, trying to gauge how much longer we had before we were overwhelmed. The seconds ticked by, and I could feel the pressure mounting. We had to hold this position, had to keep the information downloading, but the enemy was closing in fast. With one final glance at Mason, I felt a surge of determination. We couldn't let this chance slip away. I focused on the entrance, ready for the next wave, knowing we were in this fight together until the end. The room shook with the sounds of gunfire, the sharp cracks echoing off the metal walls. I focused on the terminal, watching the download progress inch forward. Every second felt like an eternity. "Hurry up," I shouted, glancing over my shoulder at Mason, who was still hunched over the console. Sweat dripped from his brow as he worked frantically. "Almost done," he yelled back, fingers moving with purpose. Bullets whizzed past us, ricocheting off the servers. I ducked behind a metal rack, my heart racing. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, heightening my senses. I could hear footsteps approaching, the enemy regrouping outside. They would be through that door any second. "We need to set up a barricade," I called out to McKinnon, who was taking cover at the entrance. "On it," he replied, moving quickly to grab a nearby server rack and pushing it against the door. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the room, a desperate attempt to buy us more time. As Mason continued to work, I glanced at the door, feeling the weight of impending danger. How much longer? Just a few more seconds, Mason shouted, his voice strained. Hargrave and the others were firing back at the enemies pouring in, but I could see the numbers were overwhelming. The sound of shouts and gunfire echoed, a testament to the fierce battle we were engaged in. "Keep them off us," McKinnon yelled, his rifle trained on the doorway, firing steadily. I moved to cover him, my own weapon raised. "I'll watch the other side." Mason looked up from the terminal, urgency in his eyes. "I need a clear shot to finish this." The pressure mounted. I could hear the enemy soldiers yelling orders, their footsteps growing louder. They were just outside the door, ready to storm in. I took a deep breath, focusing on the doorway, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Get ready," McKinnon warned, glancing back at Mason. "Finish the download." A loud crash rang out as the enemy kicked the door, but our barricade held. The metal shuddered under the impact, but it wouldn't last long. I could see shadows moving on the other side, soldiers ready to push through. "I can do this, just a little longer," Mason shouted, eyes glued to the screen. Suddenly, the door gave way, and soldiers flooded into the room, weapons raised. I squeezed the trigger, sending rounds into the first group. The others responded in kind, chaos erupting once more. "Push them back," McKinnon ordered, firing at the closest enemy. I kept firing, my shots connecting, but more soldiers were coming. The room felt small and claustrophobic, and I could feel the heat of the battle surrounding me. I glanced at Mason again. "We can't hold them much longer." "Almost done," he replied, his voice a mix of strain and determination. The download bar flickered, moving closer to completion. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that every second counted. I turned back to the entrance, ready for another wave. "Keep firing," McKinnon shouted, pushing against the barricade. The soldiers were relentless, pouring into the room, and I could feel the tension rising. I shot another soldier, but the enemy was closing in. Hargrave shouted to her team to hold the line, but it was clear we were fighting a losing battle. "Hold them back," I shouted, ducking as bullets whizzed past. "I can't do this without covering fire," Mason called, panic creeping into his voice. Just then, I heard a loud crash. The barricade started to give way. McKinnon pushed harder, sweat streaming down his face as he held the door closed. "I need more time," Mason yelled, his voice strained with urgency. I felt a surge of desperation. I couldn't let Mason down. "We'll buy you time," I yelled, knowing we had to hold our ground. With a deep breath, I stood tall and fired into the advancing enemy, keeping them at bay. I could see Mason's progress, the download nearing completion, but we were running out of time. McKinnon was gritting his teeth, muscles straining as he fought to keep the door shut. The soldiers were pushing harder, and the barricade was beginning to crumble. "Get ready," he shouted. "We might have to retreat." "Not yet," I yelled back, determination fueling my voice. "We're not leaving until we get that data." Just as I said that, the door burst open, and the enemy swarmed in. I fired off several shots, taking down a couple of soldiers, but they just kept coming. "Mason, finish the download," I shouted over the chaos. "I'm trying," he replied, the screen flashing with activity. The room was a whirlwind of gunfire and shouts, the sounds blending into a chaotic symphony. My focus narrowed to the task at hand, to hold the line and protect Mason at all costs. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I looked down to see blood seeping from a wound. It wasn't fatal, but it was enough to rattle me. "Keep fighting," McKinnon barked, glancing at me. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let the pain take me down. The download bar was almost full, and I could feel the weight of the moment. If we could just hold on a little longer. "Almost there," Mason shouted, his voice laced with urgency. Just then, a grenade rolled into the room, bouncing across the floor. My stomach dropped. "Grenade!" I shouted, diving for cover. The explosion rocked the room, sending me flying backward. I hit the ground hard, my vision spinning. Dust and debris filled the air, and I struggled to push myself up, disoriented. "Get up!" I heard McKinnon yell, urgency in his voice. I managed to get to my knees, my ears ringing. I could see the chaos around me, soldiers scrambling to regain their footing. I looked over at Mason, who was still at the terminal, but I couldn't tell if he was hurt. "Mason!" I yelled, pushing through the confusion. He was still at the console, typing frantically, but the download bar was frozen. Panic surged within me. "No, finish it." Just then, Hargrave moved to cover Mason, firing at the enemy soldiers who were regrouping after the explosion. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the pain shooting through my arm. I had to keep moving. I took up a position near the console, firing at any soldier who dared come too close. The room was still filled with smoke, the smell of burnt metal and gunpowder overwhelming. I felt the adrenaline kick in again, giving me a burst of energy. "Keep firing," McKinnon ordered, sweat pouring down his face. "We can't let them take this room." I focused on the task at hand, my heart pounding as I shot another soldier. They were regrouping, trying to coordinate their attack. I could see the tension building in their ranks as they prepared to charge again. "Mason, how's the download?" I called out, my voice urgent. He glanced at me, eyes wide with fear. "It's stuck. I can't get it to finish." "You have to find a way," I yelled back, determination fueling my words. Just then, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned just in time to see a soldier trying to flank us. I aimed and fired, hitting him square in the chest. The enemy was relentless, but I refused to back down. I could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on me, but I pushed through. "Get back," I shouted, trying to rally my team. McKinnon moved to my side, firing at the soldiers advancing from the front. We had to keep them at bay long enough for Mason to finish. "We can't let them breach this room," McKinnon yelled, determination in his voice. With every shot fired, I felt the pressure mounting. I could see Mason struggling at the console, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to finish the download. "Hurry, Mason," I called out, trying to maintain focus on the fight. The download bar flickered again, but it wasn't moving. I felt a surge of frustration, my heart racing as I kept firing. "We need to find a way to override it," I shouted to McKinnon. He glanced over, then turned back to the doorway. "I'll cover you." I took a deep breath and moved closer to Mason, my eyes darting around for any threats. "We can't let them stop us now." Suddenly, a soldier rushed in from the side, and I had to react quickly. I fired, hitting him in the shoulder, but he kept coming. I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding a spray of bullets. "Mason!" I shouted as I fought off the assailant. The chaos around me swelled, bullets flying and shouting filling the air, but my focus zeroed in on Mason. "I need that download to finish," I shouted, ducking behind a nearby server. I could see his fingers flying over the keys, a frantic look in his eyes. "It's not moving," Mason replied, panic creeping into his voice. "The system is locking up." Just then, I heard McKinnon's voice bark out orders. "Get that last soldier. We can't let them regroup." I peered around the server for a clear shot, seeing the remaining enemy soldiers trying to push their way into the room. I squeezed off a couple of rounds, taking down the last one standing in the doorway. "Got him," I shouted, feeling a rush of relief. But it was short-lived. I could see more soldiers advancing from the hallway, and I knew we had to act quickly. "We need to override the system," I said, turning back to Mason. "Can you do that?" "I might be able to, but I'll need access to the mainframe," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "Then let's do it," I replied. "We'll cover you. Just get that data." "All right," Mason took a deep breath, shifting his focus back to the terminal. I turned to McKinnon, who was still firing at the doorway. "You heard him. We need to hold this position," I yelled, grabbing a nearby server rack and pushing it to create more cover between us and the enemy. "Let's make it a little harder for them," McKinnon agreed, helping me push the rack into place. With makeshift barricades now set up, I leaned against the server, catching my breath for a moment. The adrenaline rush was starting to ebb, but I forced myself to stay alert. "Mason, do whatever you need to do," I urged him, my eyes scanning the room for threats. The download bar flickered again, but remained stalled. I could see the frustration on Mason's face. Come on," he muttered, fingers tapping the keyboard as he struggled against the system's defenses. The soldiers outside were regrouping, whispering among themselves, likely planning their next move. I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. "Hargrave, get eyes on the hallway," McKinnon ordered, glancing back at the entrance. "On it," she replied, taking position near the door. I could feel the tension in the air, every second stretching out as I waited for Mason to make progress. The sound of boots echoed from the hallway, signaling that the enemy was preparing to charge. "They're coming," Hargrave warned, firing into the darkness outside the room. "Keep them back," I shouted, readying my weapon again. The soldiers stepped into view, weapons raised. I squeezed the trigger, firing at the lead soldier, who went down. But more followed, and the pressure was building. "How much longer, Mason?" I shouted, feeling my heart race. "Almost there," he yelled back, determination etched across his face. I took a deep breath, focusing on my shooting, trying to keep the advancing soldiers at bay. Each shot I fired felt like it echoed through the room, each hit giving me a sliver of hope. Then, suddenly, the screen flickered, and Mason shouted, "I got access." "Yes, now finish it," I yelled, pushing against the wall to get a better angle on the advancing enemy. The download bar jumped forward, but I could see it was still only halfway there. "We need to buy him time," McKinnon shouted, reloading his weapon. I fired again, taking out another soldier, but it only slowed the wave momentarily. They were relentless, and I could see more pouring in from behind. "Hargrave, switch to your sidearm. We need to conserve ammo," I called, glancing back at her. "I'm on it," she replied, switching weapons in a fluid motion. The enemy soldiers pushed in harder, forcing us back, their numbers overwhelming. The air was thick with tension and gunpowder, the sounds of battle filling my ears. "Mason, how's the progress?" I yelled, desperate to keep him focused. "It's still moving, but slowly," he shouted back, eyes glued to the screen. Come on," I urged, my voice rising with frustration. Just then, a grenade landed at our feet. "Grenade," McKinnon shouted, and we all dove for cover. The explosion rattled the room, throwing us backward. I hit the ground hard, feeling the air rush out of my lungs. Get up, I heard McKinnon yell, forcing myself to roll to my feet. The room was filled with dust and debris, and my ears were ringing. I looked over to Mason, who was still at the terminal, fighting to finish the download. "Mason," I shouted, rushing over to him as the soldiers regrouped. He was still tapping furiously at the keys, sweat glistening on his forehead. "I need a little more time." "We don't have time," I yelled back, firing into the advancing soldiers. More and more enemies poured into the room, and I could feel the heat of the moment pressing down on me. "We have to fall back," McKinnon shouted, taking out another soldier with a well-placed shot. I felt a surge of panic. "Not yet, Mason's almost there." Just then, the download bar moved again, this time past the halfway mark. "Yes, keep it going," I yelled, firing again at the enemies pushing through the door. But my relief was short-lived. The enemy soldiers were regaining their momentum, and I could see their leader barking orders. They were organizing themselves for one final push, and I knew we needed to act fast. "Mason, we need to go," I shouted, desperation in my voice. He looked up, eyes wide. "I can't. I'm so close." "We can't risk it. We have to retreat," McKinnon insisted, pulling back to cover Mason. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension rising. I couldn't let him down, not now. "Mason, you have to finish this now. We're losing ground." He nodded, determination flooding his features. Okay, okay. As the enemy soldiers surged forward, I moved to provide cover, my shots ringing out as I fought to keep them at bay. Hargrave, get ready to cover our retreat, I shouted, reloading my weapon. She nodded, eyes focused on the doorway. I felt the tension mount again as I took aim, firing at the approaching enemy. Mason, how's it looking? I called out, my heart racing. The download bar moved slightly, inching toward completion. I'm trying, just a little longer, he replied, fingers flying over the keys. The enemy was closing in, their resolve unbroken. I could see the leader urging his troops forward, and I knew we had to make a stand. Get down, McKinnon yelled, firing a barrage of rounds at the doorway. I ducked just in time as bullets whizzed past, but I refused to back down. We can't let them take us down. Just then, Mason shouted, I'm almost done. Keep it together, I yelled, pushing forward. But then, an enemy soldier got too close. I turned, my weapon raised, but he fired first. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as the bullet struck. No, I shouted, my vision blurring slightly as I staggered back. Hold the line, McKinnon yelled, covering me. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't let this be the end. Mason, finish the download, I shouted, feeling the pressure rise in my chest. He looked up, determination flooding his features. I'm almost there. As the download continued, I knew we were on borrowed time. The enemy was regrouping, and I could feel the tide of battle shifting against us. Hargrave, we need a distraction, I shouted, glancing back at her. She nodded, stepping into position. I'll create a diversion. Do it, I yelled, focusing on the doorway again. Just then, Hargrave tossed a flashbang into the crowd of soldiers. The explosion of light and sound caused chaos among the enemy ranks. Now, I shouted, taking advantage of the distraction. I fired into the disoriented soldiers, taking down as many as I could before they regained their footing. Mason, you have to finish, I yelled, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down. It's almost done, he shouted back, sweat glistening on his brow. The download bar moved again, nearing completion. Keep fighting, I urged, my heart racing. With renewed determination, I pushed forward, taking out the last remaining soldiers who had regrouped. Finally, I heard Mason shout, "Got it." The sound of the terminal chiming echoed through the room, and I felt a surge of hope. Now let's get out of here, I yelled, readying my weapon. Cover the exit, McKinnon ordered, stepping into the lead. As we began to move, the sounds of the enemy regrouping flooded our ears, but now we had the data we needed. Let's go, I shouted, moving toward the exit. With one last look at Mason, I knew we had to escape before reinforcements arrived. The battle was far from over, but we had survived this encounter. We were battered and bruised, but we had each other, and that was enough to keep going. Move, 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 McKinnon shouted, pushing through the doorway. We barreled down the hallway, my heart pounding as we made our escape. The fight was still raging behind us, but now we had the advantage. As we sprinted forward, I could hear the sounds of battle fading into the distance. We were alive, and we had accomplished our mission. Keep moving, I urged, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We turned the corner, still on high alert, but there was a sense of victory in the air. We had made it out alive, and we weren't going to stop fighting. We would regroup, strategize, and fight back. This was just the beginning. The war wasn't over, and we had a mission to complete. Together, we would find a way to finish what we started, no matter what it took. Mason's fingers danced across the keyboard, but the data was still crawling to completion. The room was hot, thick with tension, every second hanging in the balance. The incoming soldiers outside the doorway didn't wait. They surged forward, their coordinated steps louder now. It was clear they weren't amateurs. These were professional killers, trained for moments like this. Their squad leader barked orders in a language I couldn't understand, but I didn't need a translator to know what he was saying. Finish them. McKinnon growled under his breath, his rifle raised, keeping his cool despite the oncoming wave. They're testing us, looking for a weak spot. They're about to hit hard. I could hear the shift in their footfalls, faster, more urgent. There wasn't much time left. I reloaded, my heart hammering, keeping my eyes on the narrow entryway, where the next round of hell was about to come through. Hargrave crouched beside me, her sidearm drawn, eyes narrowed. We're going to get overrun if this doesn't wrap up soon. Not yet. I fired another burst, suppressing the front of the advancing squad. Mason's almost done. We hold until he's finished. There was no more discussion. We held the line, knowing the odds were stacked against us. Another grenade flew through the doorway, but this time Hargrave reacted fast, kicking it back out before it could detonate inside the room. It exploded just outside, taking a few of the attackers with it. McKinnon grunted in approval, but his tone stayed grim. We can't keep this up much longer. I was about to respond when Mason suddenly cursed. They're on to us. The system's fighting back harder than I thought. I glanced over at him, blood pumping in my ears. How much longer? He didn't answer right away, his jaw clenched. The progress bar was agonizingly slow, barely moving. The enemy's footsteps shifted again. They were regrouping for a more coordinated strike. I could see it in the way their shadows moved, overlapping and covering angles. Here they come, McKinnon muttered, tensing up beside me. They came in force this time, a coordinated volley of gunfire aimed directly at our positions. I felt the whizzing of bullets as they chipped away at our makeshift cover. There wasn't enough room to duck or hide anymore. It was all about keeping them off us, pushing them back. Hargrave gritted her teeth, rising to return fire. These bastards are getting smarter. They don't need to be smart, McKinnon snapped, squeezing off a few well-placed shots. They just need to swarm us. It was true. Even with our skills, we couldn't handle this many for long. Mason, I shouted again, gritting my teeth, my body on edge as I fired back at the doorway, barely keeping them at bay. If we don't leave soon, we're screwed. He was sweating now, his voice strained. I just need. A shot rang out, close, too close. McKinnon cried out, dropping to one knee, blood pouring from a fresh wound in his side. Hargrave rushed to cover him, her sidearm blazing. McKinnon, I yelled, eyes flicking toward the wound. But there was no time to help. The enemy was pushing harder, taking advantage of the momentary lapse in our fire. Mason slammed the keyboard with frustration. I'm losing the connection. They've scrambled the network. My mind raced. If we didn't get the data, everything we'd risked, everything we'd fought for would be pointless. But we couldn't hold out any longer. Not like this. Hargrave cursed as she popped another magazine into her sidearm. We need to move. Now. Damn it, Mason hissed, his hands hovering over the keyboard, fingers shaking. It's almost there, but I can't. There was no more time to debate. We had to make a call. Abort, I said through gritted teeth, my voice barely audible over the roar of gunfire. Mason snapped his head toward me, eyes wide. What? I didn't answer him. The decision had already been made. Hargrave, get McKinnon on his feet. We're moving out. Mason slammed his fist on the console, his face twisted with frustration. We can't just leave. We're dead if we stay, I barked back. We regroup and figure out the next step after we get out alive. Move. Hargrave pulled McKinnon to his feet, supporting his weight as we began to fall back. I kept my weapon raised, eyes fixed on the hallway as we moved in reverse. Mason hesitated for a split second longer before grabbing his gear and following suit. I could see the disappointment etched across his face, but survival was the priority now. The enemy wasn't going to let us retreat without a fight. They pressed forward with renewed energy, firing down the hallway as we retreated toward the back of the server room. Bullets slammed into the walls, showering us with debris as we ducked and weaved through the maze of equipment. We need to hold them off long enough to reach the evac point, Hargrave called out, still supporting McKinnon, who was gritting his teeth against the pain. I nodded, quickly assessing the best way to create distance between us and the advancing soldiers. We couldn't keep running. Eventually, they'd overtake us. Hargrave, you've got explosives in your pack, right? I asked, an idea forming. She nodded, understanding where I was going with this. I've got just enough to rig a couple of surprises. Do it, I ordered. We'll slow them down and buy ourselves some time. Hargrave quickly dug into her pack, pulling out a handful of small explosives. While she worked, I fired off a few shots to keep the enemy at bay, but they were closing in fast. You better hurry, I muttered, reloading again, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion setting in. Almost done, Hargrave replied, placing the charges in strategic locations around the room. She set the timers, and we prepared to fall back once again. This will give us a few seconds, tops, she warned as she stood up, her eyes locked on the doorway. I nodded, motioning for everyone to move. That's all we need. We dashed toward the exit as the sound of footsteps echoed closer. Just as we rounded the corner, the explosives detonated, sending a deafening shockwave through the room. The walls shook, and a thick cloud of smoke and debris filled the air, obscuring the enemy's vision. Go, 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 I shouted, pushing Mason forward as we sprinted down the hallway. We didn't stop, didn't look back. The explosion would slow them down, but it wouldn't stop them. We needed to get as far away as possible, regroup, and figure out our next move. The hallway twisted and turned, a maze of steel and concrete, but we knew where we were going. The evac point wasn't far, just a few more turns and we'd be clear. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought in the back of my mind. We had failed to get the data. Everything we had sacrificed so far had been for nothing. As we reached the final corridor, I glanced at Mason, whose face was a mask of frustration and defeat. He had been so close, and now it was all slipping away. I pushed the thoughts aside. Survival first. We could deal with the fallout later. The exit loomed ahead, the door already open. We were almost there. But then, a loud clang echoed through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the floor behind us. The enemy was closing in again. They're right on our heels, McKinnon shouted, gritting his teeth as he limped forward with Hargrave's support. We hit the corridor, the metal walls rattling from the impact of the explosion behind us. The boots were closer now, heavy and determined, the pace quickening as the enemy surged after us. We need to hold them here, I shouted, spinning around to face the oncoming threat. Hargrave helped McKinnon into a half-covered corner, while Mason was already panting by the exit door. His frustration was palpable, but it wasn't the time for that now. I'm good, McKinnon muttered, forcing himself up, gritting against the pain. He wasn't. But he knew the situation we were in. The first shadow appeared around the corner. I opened fire immediately, 3 rounds in quick succession. They hit the target, the first man crumpling to the ground, but there were more behind him. A lot more. Hargrave knelt beside me, returning fire with short, controlled bursts. We can't keep this up. They're going to push through. Just a few more seconds, I replied, my voice hard. Mason, get that door ready. It's rigged, Mason called back, but it won't hold long. I felt the sting of a near miss, the bullet whizzing past my ear, embedding itself in the wall behind me. The soldiers weren't hesitating now. They were pushing hard, their return fire forcing us to duck behind the sparse cover we had. I looked to the side, catching a glimpse of Hargrave reloading, her fingers steady despite the chaos. Another body fell, but for every one of them, 2 more came around the corner. They were better equipped, faster, and organized. We were running out of time. Mason, hit it now, I shouted, seeing the inevitable in front of me. Mason didn't wait. He hit the detonator, and the door slid closed, sealing us inside. For now. The gunfire outside stopped for a brief second. They were probably rethinking their approach, realizing we'd blocked their immediate entry. But I knew it wouldn't hold. Not with the tech they had. They'd be through in minutes. The reinforced steel would slow them down, but only just. McKinnon slumped against the wall, clutching his side. We don't have much time. Hargrave was already looking at me, her expression hard but expectant. What now? I scanned the room. There was another exit, but it was across an open expanse. A shooting gallery. If they breached, we'd be sitting ducks trying to cross it. Mason wiped the sweat from his face, still visibly shaken. There's a maintenance shaft back near the server core, he said, voice strained. We can use it to drop down to the lower levels. Maybe slip past them while they're trying to get through here. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. All right, we move now. Hargrave, you cover the rear. Mason, you lead the way. Let's go. Mason nodded, already making his way toward the far end of the room where the maintenance shaft was located. Hargrave checked her weapon one more time, giving McKinnon a look that said, "You're not done yet." We moved quickly, every step deliberate but urgent. Behind us, I could hear the faint scraping of metal. The soldiers were working on the door, and it wouldn't be long before they made it through. Mason reached the shaft first, pulling open the panel. It's a tight fit, he muttered, glancing inside. But it leads straight down to the maintenance tunnels. Hargrave helped McKinnon to his feet, steadying him as he stumbled forward. Go first, I'll cover, she ordered. Mason climbed in, disappearing into the darkness below. McKinnon followed, groaning as he squeezed his larger frame into the narrow opening. Hargrave stayed back, her rifle trained on the door, waiting. Go, I told her. I'll take rear guard. She gave me a quick nod and slipped into the shaft without hesitation. I took one last glance at the sealed door, the faint sounds of grinding metal growing louder. They were close now. I climbed into the shaft, pulling the panel closed behind me. The air was stifling inside, and the walls pressed in on all sides as I made my way down the ladder. The darkness was thick, only the faint glow of a flashlight from Mason ahead guiding the way. The seconds stretched as we descended, the only sound the clang of boots on metal rungs. Every movement felt sluggish, like time itself was against us. McKinnon grunted in pain below me, his injury slowing him down, but he pushed through without complaint. The shaft was tight, and his bulky frame barely fit, but he didn't stop. Finally, we reached the bottom, a graded floor leading into the maintenance tunnels Mason had mentioned. It was cooler here, damp, the air thick with a smell of old oil and machinery. The sound of the facility's systems hummed around us, but there was no sign of pursuit. Not yet. Which way? Hargrave asked, her voice low, eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. Mason pulled up a small handheld device, checking the readings. This way, he said, pointing to the left. It'll take us further into the core of the complex. From there, we can. A loud bang echoed from above, cutting him off. The breach? They were through. Move, I ordered, my voice harsh. Now. We took off down the corridor, our footsteps echoing against the metal walls. The sound of pursuit grew distant, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they found the shaft and followed us down. We couldn't afford to stop. Mason led us through a series of twists and turns, the tunnels narrowing and widening in erratic patterns. Pipes lined the walls, some dripping with condensation, others humming with the flow of whatever systems ran this part of the complex. McKinnon was breathing hard, every step clearly a struggle, but he didn't complain. Hargrave stayed close to him, her rifle ready, her focus sharp. Finally, we reached a larger junction, the tunnel splitting off in multiple directions. Mason hesitated, checking his device again, frowning. What's wrong? Hargrave asked, her voice tense. Mason glanced up, his expression frustrated. We should have reached the core by now. Something's off. No time for doubt, I said, keeping my voice steady. Pick a path and go. We can't stop here. He nodded, turning toward the tunnel on the right. This way. We followed, but the further we went, the more the tunnel seemed to twist back on itself. The sounds of the complex were quieter here, but something else was wrong. I could feel it. Suddenly, Mason stopped dead in his tracks. No, this is wrong. This isn't the way. Hargrave stepped forward, her patience thin. "What do you mean? Wrong, you said?" "The layout's different," Mason cut in, frustration clear in his voice. "The data I pulled, it said this tunnel leads to the core, but—" I cut him off, my instincts flaring. "We've been rerouted." Mason looked at me, confusion in his eyes. "What? How?" I didn't have the answers, but I could feel it in my gut. The facility had shifted, changed. Whether it was a security protocol or something else, we weren't where we were supposed to be, and that meant we were trapped. "What now?" Hargrave asked, her voice sharp. I took a deep breath, thinking quickly. We couldn't turn back, the enemy was closing in. But if we stayed here, we were sitting ducks. "We push forward," I said, my voice firm. "Find another exit. There's always another way out." Mason looked skeptical, but he didn't argue. Hargrave simply nodded, her eyes hard. McKinnon was silent, his face pale but determined. We moved again, the sense of urgency weighing heavier with each step. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I could feel the walls closing in around us. Every instinct screamed that we were being funneled into a trap. But there was no other option. Finally, we reached another junction, this one wider, the ceiling higher. It looked like some kind of loading area, old equipment scattered around the room. But the walls were solid, no obvious exit in sight. Mason cursed under his breath. "We're stuck." I didn't answer. My mind was racing, searching for a way out. There had to be something. A hatch, a vent, anything. Then I saw it. A small panel, half hidden behind a stack of crates. It wasn't much, but it was our only shot. "There," I pointed. "We go through there." Mason rushed over, prying the panel open with a grunt. Inside was another maintenance shaft, this one leading upward. "It's tight," he said, glancing back at McKinnon. "But it's the only way." Hargrave was already moving, helping McKinnon toward the shaft. I kept my weapon raised, scanning the room, waiting for the inevitable. The sound of boots echoed down the tunnel behind us. They were close, too close. "Go," I ordered, shoving Mason forward. He climbed in first, followed by McKinnon, his breathing labored but steady. Hargrave went next, her rifle slung over her shoulder as she pulled herself up. I stayed behind, covering the rear, listening as the boots grew louder, closer. The moment McKinnon disappeared into the shaft, I turned and followed, pulling the panel closed behind me. We climbed. The tunnel was narrow, the air thick and suffocating, but we didn't stop. I could hear the soldiers behind us, their voices muffled but angry. They'd found the loading area. It wouldn't take long before they realized where we'd gone. But we were already ahead, already moving. The climb felt endless, my muscles burning with every pull, but I forced myself to keep going. There was no room for fatigue, not now. Finally, we reached the top, another small room, this one with a single door. The door at the top of the shaft was heavier than expected, but Hargrave forced it open, her face set in determination. I hauled myself out next, then reached back to pull McKinnon through. He grunted, his leg visibly shaking from the effort of climbing. I could see the exhaustion in his face, but he wasn't giving up. Hargrave didn't waste time, already scanning the room for threats. Mason pulled himself out last, immediately setting to work checking his handheld device again, muttering under his breath. We were in another tight space, a storage room, by the look of it. Stacks of old crates lined the walls, covered in dust and grime. No windows, one door, and no telling what lay beyond it. "What's the plan now?" Hargrave asked, keeping her voice low. Her eyes flicked to McKinnon, concern creeping into her usual stoic expression. I didn't answer immediately. The enemy was still out there, still tracking us, but I needed to think. We couldn't keep running indefinitely. We needed to either lose them or find a way to turn the tables, and McKinnon wasn't going to hold up much longer unless we found a place to regroup. Mason tapped a few more commands into his device, his frown deepening. "We're close to the core," he said, "but this isn't where we should have come out. The layout's still off. I don't know what the hell is going on with this place, but something's. Save it, I cut in, my tone sharper than I intended. We don't have time for speculation. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the metal surface. Silence. For now. McKinnon let out a deep breath, wiping sweat from his brow. I can keep going, he said, though it was more for his own sake than ours. We need to hold up for a second, let you catch your breath, I replied. But we can't stay here long. They'll catch up soon. I moved to Mason's side. Is there a way to sabotage the core? Slow them down if they're trying to use this place for anything. Mason looked up, his eyes narrowing as he considered it. Maybe, but I'd have to get into the system directly. From here, I can only pull maps and data, not control anything. Hargrave shifted on her feet. Then we move. We don't have the luxury of sitting around. I nodded, already reaching for the door's control panel. It slid open with a hiss, revealing a narrow hallway, dimly lit. The sterile, metallic scent of the facility returned, along with the distant hum of machinery. No signs of immediate pursuit, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. I motioned for them to follow, and we slipped out, one by one, Hargrave taking the rear again. The hallway stretched ahead, a maze of identical walls and junctions. We kept moving, our boots barely making a sound against the polished floor. Every corner we turned, my eyes scanned for cameras, for any hint of movement. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling the silence became. It was too quiet. Even in a place like this, you'd expect more activity. Something wasn't right. After a few minutes, Mason raised a hand, signaling a stop. He pointed to a console embedded into the wall, a faint glow coming from its interface. "This might give us something," he whispered, stepping toward it. "Make it quick," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the corridor ahead. My instincts were screaming now, every fiber of my being on edge. Mason's fingers moved quickly across the console, pulling up data streams, schematics. I could see his face twist in concentration, his brows furrowed. "What is it?" I asked, not turning around. "This place," he started, his voice trailing off. "It's not what it seems. The layout's been modified. There are entire sections that shouldn't exist, according to the base design." "Modified how?" Hargrave asked, stepping closer, her rifle still at the ready. "I don't know yet, but these pathways, they weren't built by us. This looks more like alien," I finished for him. Mason looked up, eyes wide. "Exactly." "That doesn't help us right now," Hargrave cut in. "We need to keep moving." "Wait," Mason said, pulling up another file. "There's a maintenance route leading straight to the core. We take it, we can get in, figure out what's going on, and maybe shut down whatever the hell they're doing here." I didn't like the sound of that. Heading straight for the core meant walking into the heart of whatever trap was waiting for us. But we didn't have many other options. Sitting around and hoping for a miracle wasn't one of them. I nodded. "Lead the way." We moved again, faster this time, our footsteps echoing off the empty halls. The sterile corridors began to change, growing rougher, the walls less polished. I could see the signs of recent construction, patches where the original structure had been altered. Mason was right, something had been tampered with. As we approached the core, the air grew warmer, the hum of machinery louder. The door to the core chamber stood before us, massive and imposing, sealed tight. "This is it," Mason said, his voice hushed. He stepped forward, accessing the door's control panel, fingers flying across the interface. A moment later, the door slid open with a groan, revealing the chamber beyond. The core was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A massive structure, pulsing with energy, surrounded by conduits and machinery that didn't match human designs. The alien influence was unmistakable now. Glowing circuits and strange symbols lined the walls, the tech blending seamlessly with our own. "This isn't right," Hargrave muttered, her eyes scanning the room. "This place, it's not human anymore." Mason stepped toward the core, his face pale. "I don't even know where to begin." "Start with whatever looks like it can shut this down," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We don't have time to hesitate." He nodded, moving quickly to the nearest console. His hand shook slightly as he worked, accessing files, bypassing security measures. "There's some kind of override," he muttered, "but it's encrypted. This might take a minute." I moved to the center of the room, keeping an eye on the doors. The tension in the air was thick, every second dragging longer than it should. Hargrave was pacing now, her eyes flicking between Mason and the doors, waiting for the inevitable. Suddenly, Mason froze. "Wait, something's wrong." "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. "The core. It's not just powering this facility," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's sending a signal to something outside." Hargrave stiffened. "A signal? To what?" Mason's face drained of color. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's big, and it's already been activated." The room seemed to close in around us, the reality of what we were facing sinking in. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. We were in the middle of something far bigger than we'd realized. "Can you stop it?" I asked, my voice cold. Mason shook his head. I don't think so. Not without more time." We didn't have time. I could hear it now, the sound of boots approaching, growing louder by the second. They were coming. "Then we make our stand here," I said, my voice hard. "Hargrave, set up defenses. We hold them off as long as we can." Hargrave nodded, moving swiftly to position herself behind one of the consoles, her rifle trained on the door. McKinnon, still pale but determined, raised his weapon, his breathing steady now. Mason was still working, his fingers flying across the interface, desperation in his eyes. "I'll keep trying to shut it down, but I can't promise anything." I nodded. "Just do what you can." The door at the far end of the room burst open, and the first of the enemy soldiers poured in. I raised my rifle, my mind going blank as instinct took over. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the heart of an alien conspiracy. But we weren't going down without a fight. The first shots rang out, and the room erupted into chaos. The battle raged on, filling the room with the sharp crack of gunfire and the hiss of alien energy blasts. Hargrave took out two of the soldiers as they surged through the door, her aim precise and lethal. McKinnon was holding his ground, teeth gritted in pain, but still firing. I fired in controlled bursts, trying to conserve ammo, each shot aimed at center mass. But they kept coming, more soldiers, more heavily armed than before. "Mason, we need that core shut down now," I shouted over the din, taking cover behind a steel column as another barrage of fire ripped through the air. Mason's hands flew across the console, his face a mask of concentration. "I'm working on it," he yelled back. "This encryption is layered. Whoever set this up didn't want it undone." "We don't have time for careful work. Just rip the damn thing apart," Hargrave snapped, ducking behind her cover as another group of soldiers stormed in. The room was becoming a killing field. More enemy forces poured in, using the crates and equipment for cover, firing back at us with deadly accuracy. I could hear the sizzle of their energy weapons growing closer, the ground shaking slightly with the force of their blasts. I glanced at McKinnon. He was pale, blood seeping from a wound in his side. But he wasn't giving up, still pulling the trigger, his breath ragged but focused. Hargrave was keeping them back for now, but we were running out of time. They'd overwhelm us soon, and Mason still hadn't shut down the core. I slid across the floor to Mason's position, crouching low. "Forget about the encryption. Can you fry the system? Overload it." Mason looked up, wide-eyed. "Overloading it could cause the whole facility to go up. We'd have minutes to get out, if that." "We don't have minutes, Mason. It's either that, or we die right here." His jaw clenched. Then he nodded, hands moving faster across the controls. "Okay, I'll overload the core's power grid, but we'll have to run the moment it starts to cascade." I nodded, already moving back to Hargrave and McKinnon. "Mason's going to blow the core. We've got to hold them off until then." Hargrave's eyes narrowed. "How long?" "A few minutes at most. When he gives the signal, we fall back. But we need to hold this position until then." McKinnon coughed, grimacing as he reloaded. "A few minutes feels like a lifetime right now." I couldn't disagree. The enemy was pressing harder, their tactics more aggressive. They weren't just trying to kill us, they were trying to stop us from reaching the core. They knew we were close to disrupting whatever they were doing. Hargrave fired off another shot, dropping a soldier who had pushed too far ahead. "Here they come." The next wave hit us harder than the last, a coordinated rush that forced us back into cover. Energy blasts seared past us, too close for comfort. I returned fire, feeling the heat of an alien round grazing my shoulder. The pain was sharp, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. We couldn't afford to falter now. "Mason, how much longer?" I shouted. "Almost there," he called back, his voice strained. I peeked out from behind cover, lining up another shot, but my vision was blurred for a moment. The room felt like it was closing in, too many enemies, not enough time. Hargrave was breathing hard, her face smeared with sweat and dirt, but she hadn't missed a shot yet. Then, a loud hum filled the room, louder than the gunfire, a low vibration that seemed to shake the walls themselves. "That's it," Mason yelled. "The core's overloading. We need to go, now." "Fall back," I shouted to Hargrave and McKinnon. We moved as one, laying down suppressing fire as we made for the far exit. The enemy was still advancing, but they hadn't realized what was happening yet. The hum grew louder, and I could feel the heat from the core intensifying. Mason had done it. The core was destabilizing, and in moments, the entire facility would come down. We burst through the door into the corridor, sprinting down the hall as fast as we could. Behind us, the core chamber erupted into flames, the sound of metal tearing apart filling the air. The walls around us groaned, buckling under the strain of the explosion. McKinnon was limping now, his leg nearly giving out, but Hargrave grabbed his arm, hauling him forward. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice sharp. The corridors blurred past us as we ran, the sound of destruction following close behind. Mason led the way, his handheld device still clutched tightly in his hand, guiding us through the maze of halls. We turned corner after corner, the heat and tremors growing stronger with each step. Finally, we burst into a large hangar bay, the ceiling partially collapsed from the blast. A transport shuttle sat near the far end, its hatch open and engines still running. It must have been left behind by whoever had occupied the base. "Get in," I shouted, helping McKinnon limp toward the shuttle. Hargrave covered us, firing a few more shots at the pursuing soldiers as they spilled into the hangar. But they were too late. We piled into the shuttle, Mason taking the pilot's seat, frantically hitting the controls. "Hang on," he yelled, and the shuttle lurched into the air, just as another explosion tore through the facility. We rocketed out of the hangar, the force of the blast propelling us higher into the sky. Below us, the base collapsed in on itself, a massive plume of smoke and fire erupting into the atmosphere. The signal had been cut. The enemy's plans, whatever they were, had been stopped, at least for now. The shuttle leveled out, and we sat in silence, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. McKinnon slumped back in his seat, breathing hard. Hargrave checked her ammo, her face still unreadable. Mason was pale, but focused, guiding the shuttle away from the destruction below. We had survived. Barely. But as I looked out the window at the smoldering ruins below, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot.